My name is Devalila. We're here again with Nayaswami Devarshi, author of this beautiful, deeply inspiring book, Kriya Yoga, Spiritual Awakening for the New Age. Devarshi, you were speaking in our last episode of energy and how Kriya Yoga is brought into this new age. Can you speak more about that?
Yes, because this really is how Kriya Yoga really works. It works with awakening and helping us to develop more energy and learning how to have control over that energy, which the yogis for thousands of years have referred to as pranayama, control of the life force. And when one develops that control, as I was saying earlier, one can deal with situations with one's own emotions, with really stressful life situations like we all experienced during the pandemic. And so Kriya Yoga does that, but it also works on this idea of changing our magnetism. And you see that some people are very magnetic, some people are low energy and unmagnetic. And this concept of magnetism is very important to understand when we are really trying to learn how to change ourselves, how to be successful, how to make changes in our own life. And so Kriya Yoga teaches principles of working with energy, but it also talks about this idea of developing greater magnetism.
Can you speak more about magnetism and how that translates? What does that mean for us to be magnetic?
That's a good question because it gets to the very heart of how we succeed in life, really, is changing our magnetism. But in order to do that, we also have to learn, as we've been talking, about changing our level of energy, having control over that energy. Now, energy, Yogananda, one of his little sort of aphorism that really is very important, he said that the greater the will, the greater the flow of energy. And so these teachings of Kriya don't make one passive. They make one develop your own willpower and inner strength in a very dynamic way. And so this is not a spiritual path for people who are passive and just wanting God to do all the work. We have to put out energy and willpower. And when we do that in the right way, Yogananda even taught these energization exercises that use the will to draw cosmic energy into our bodies, minds and souls, and learning how to have more energy and then learning how to control it. But then another important thing to understand is that the greater the flow of energy, the greater the magnetism. And it's on this principle of magnetism where really that's how our life starts to change. You see people who have energy, who are personally magnetic, and it seems like good things happen to them. And good things happen because people who have a strong positive energy also have a strong positive magnetism. And I'll use an analogy, which I share in the book here. When I was in grade school, we did an experiment with magnetism. And we took some iron filings, some powdered iron, put it on top of a piece of paper. And then we took a horseshoe magnet and we held that horseshoe magnet underneath the paper. And the iron filings gravitated towards the magnetism that was underneath. And when you tried to rearrange those iron filings on the piece of paper, they would always go back to the underlying magnetism. Now, this is our lives in a nutshell. People who only try to change the outer circumstances of their lives and just rearrange the iron filings of their lives, those iron filings, they come back to the same old pattern. And so, people change jobs and they end up going down the same path of maybe not succeeding because the underlying magnetism has not changed. Changing relationships, changing spouses, doing all these different things that are just outside. But if the underlying magnetism stays the same, it will just gravitate back to the old patterns, maybe in a different form and in a different way. And so when we change our magnetism, then we can really make changes in our lives. And so this is really one of the most important principles of how Kriya Yoga as a whole way of life starts to change our lives. So we work at increasing our level of energy in a positive way and increasing our magnetism. And it's not just enough to have more energy. I think we've all met people who are very highly energetic, but extremely negative. And when you're around such people, it's very difficult because, as Yogananda put it, a strong magnet will influence a weak magnet. And if someone has a very strong negative energy, and we have sort of a weak positive energy, they will upset us. It will be very difficult for us to deal with them. And so Kriya Yoga shows us how to increase our level of energy in a very positive way. And then by that, by extension, our magnetism really starts to increase and develop over time, and especially into spiritual magnetism. And Yogananda, I've seen this. He says this, but I've seen it. And what I speak of is direct experience of these truths, that when our magnetism starts to change into a much more positive, dynamic way, our life changes. We start to attract friends who are more positive. We start to attract friends who are more spiritually uplifting and can help support us in our own spiritual practices. So this is how we change the underlying magnetism underneath the piece of paper. And then just magically, the iron filings start to change. And you start to see seemingly magical changes in the circumstances of our life. But it's because we're also working at changing the magnet underneath through these practices. And then the outer life, just suddenly things seem to start going much better in our lives. And that's because a path like Kriya Yoga changes the underlying magnetism.
That is fascinating and very helpful, that analogy. Can you share some examples of how that underlying magnetism can change our lives?
Sure. And this book has many, many different examples of these things. These are from my own personal life, but they're not really personal stories. They really, in a way, are universal experiences. But this just shows the reality of these practices in one person's life, but really it's in everyone's life. I'll give one simple example, and this is a very mundane one. Now, one of Yogananda's teachers, the gurus, he said to solve all your problems through meditation, through Kriya Yoga, through these practices. And it's not magical how it works. It's not like you do a practice and it's just automatic and mechanical and, like some hocus pocus and our problems get solved. No, it's by practicing these things, we start to change ourselves. And the person trying to solve the problem, us, starts to change and become better able to work with an intuitive understanding of a problem, of how to work with another person, how to make a change in our life, but also by changing the magnetism. In his book, Autobiography of a Yogi, Yogananda, he says something that's really food for thought. And it's really kind of revolutionary in a way. He says that thoughts are universally and not individually rooted. Thoughts are universally and not individually rooted, meaning that we don't create a thought. We draw thoughts and inspirations through our own magnetism by attracting them. And, the example you can see in the lives of great scientists or composers that, Einstein, for example, when he came up with the theory of relativity, he didn't invent that. He tuned into something that was already there, that was already a reality. And when he understood it, it's because his magnetism attracted the theory of relativity as a great inspiration. And then, only then, after it came to him, did he have to spend years explaining it and trying to translate it to ordinary people and even to other scientists. But it came because his magnetism, through his efforts to try to find truth, to try to understand the reality behind this seemingly material world, it generated the magnetism that attracted that inspiration. And there are some great composers who have talked about, I'm thinking of Handel, who wrote the Messiah, which is still famous and inspiring many hundreds of years later. He said that whole composition came to him from outside almost. He said he was in a very spiritually uplifted state. He said that he heard all that music as if sung by angels, and all he did in a way was write it down. And so you can see that thoughts, inspirations, solutions to problems, they're all out there. And when we uplift and change our magnetism, those things come to us. You see this in another example. When we're really moody, depressed, sad, our energy is really low, the thoughts that come to us are automatically negative and supportive of our mood in some ways. And when we're positive and uplifted, we attract thoughts and inspirations that are, relate and are drawn to that kind of magnetism. And I share a story in the book where I was working on Swami Kriyananda's staff. Swami Kriyananda is the founder of Ananda Sangha and was a direct disciple of Paramhansa Yogananda. And I was working on his staff, and there had been a construction project around his home. And when the project was finished, everybody left, all the carpenters, the electricians, the plumbers, everyone. And I was left to deal with some of the unfinished situations there. And there was one problem that was just extremely difficult and annoying. It had to do with some sounds that were being made in the plumbing and the pipes. They were really kind of obnoxious and irritating, and just all day long, every minute or two, it would make this really loud noise. And I called the plumbers. They came. They could not figure out what the problem was. I called electricians. I called everybody. No one could figure it out. And Swami Kriyananda kept asking me, well, have you figured this out yet? I mean, it was such a simple kind of a thing. But everyone left, and I was left to my own devices. And I was trying to find an answer. I knew there must be an answer, so I was positive. I hadn't given up, but I couldn't find it. One day I was meditating, and I was practicing Kriya Yoga, and I was practicing. I wasn't thinking of my problems. And I was in a good meditative state. I was uplifted. I wasn't like in some huge state, but I was in a good uplifted state. And suddenly, out of the blue, almost as an inspiration, well, I wouldn't say almost, it was an inspiration, the solution to this problem just suddenly came to me, even though I wasn't thinking about it. But obviously, maybe on some subconscious level, it was there. But I drew the solution through my magnetism by being in an uplifted state. Because when you're in an uplifted state, you place yourself in the realm of positive ideas and positive inspirations. Even solutions to plumbing problems can be solved through Kriya Yoga. And so it was a very unusual problem. It was a completely out-of-the-box solution. And we fixed that problem, a plumbing problem, through Kriya Yoga. Now, I share many more examples of how changing our magnetism and working with our energy helps us to solve much more compelling problems in our lives, personal relationships, problems with dealing with negative emotions. I talk about just the grief and loss that I felt when my own wife of 25 years passed away. And these are just very human situations that we all go through. And again, just talking about one's religion is tested in the cold, hard light of day. Yes, even with our own emotional lives, our very human lives, our human hearts, which go through just all the ups and downs that humanity goes through. And you can see, and I've seen it time and time again, and again with many, many others who have learned these things, that Kriya Yoga can help us solve pretty much any problem in our lives. Not in a magical way, but by giving us the strength, the control over our energy and our emotions, and give us really the power and just the ability to solve the problems. And so that's how meditation and Kriya can really be applied to solve any problem in life. One of the ways that this works is that when our emotions are very agitated, we don't see things clearly. We even that expression, the person was seeing red, is an expression. It's just like their mind was so agitated and they were so angry or upset that everywhere they looked, they saw red. It was just this very fiery, upset state. And so one of the techniques that are part of the whole body and practice of Kriya Yoga is a simple technique that works with calming the waves of emotion in our hearts. And it doesn't deaden human feeling, it just calms it. And Yogananda uses the analogy that it's a bit like when you're at night and there's a lake in front of you and it's a full moon, and there's the wind on the lake is just causing agitated waves on the lake. You see the reflection of the moon, but really it's just sparkles of light and moving light, and you can't really tell what is there in that lake and what's being reflected because it's so agitated. And that's what it's like when our emotions are agitated, the waves of feeling of the heart. The practices of meditation, some of the very simple ones, and there's a very particular technique given by Yogananda that helps to calm the waves of human emotion. And then when you start to look at that lake, then it becomes very calm, and you can see the moon perfectly reflected in that lake. And this is what happens when we calm our feelings through working with the life force, certain breathing exercises and things that help with this. Then when our emotions are calm, we can see more clearly. And you can see this, I think we've all experienced being really upset and really emotional, lashing out at someone, and we just don't see clearly that maybe this person was trying to help us, or we just don't see the world clearly because our own upset is hiding it. And so the practice of meditation also helps by helping us to see much more clearly what is going on around us, and it helps us to calm ourselves. And you see this with people who are very calm and very awake and energetic, but in a very calm way. They can see things more clearly. And so this is what Kriya Yoga does in all of these practices. It helps us to see others more clearly, situations, but also our own selves and our own emotions and our own problems more clearly. And this is one of the ways that Kriya, the practice of meditation, can help us solve our very personal and human problems that we all go through in life.
Thank you for that. That's very clear. If a person has a lot of challenges, karmic challenges, is Kriya Yoga enough? Or do they also have to work with attitudes and other things? Or is Kriya in itself all that's needed?
Yeah, that's a good question. Now, Kriya is a technique, but it's also a whole way of life. And so, no, just doing the technique in a mechanical way, working with the breath, by itself doesn't magically solve the problems. Swami Kriyananda would often say about Kriya Yoga that it's not mechanical in the results that it gives. And so it's just not just a matter of doing some mechanical exercises and then all of our problems are solved. What Kriya does is that, yes, it calms our emotions, gives us inner strength, more energy, more ability to deal with situations. But we also, at the same time, Kriya is not just what we do when we're sitting in our meditation room. It's a whole way of life. It's a whole approach to life. And so we also just talk about in the path of Kriya Yoga, and again, Yogananda taught these same things. It's working on our attitudes, how we deal with situations, how we deal with other people, and how we actually work with these things in real life. Because again, it's so important that for our spiritual life to be true and to be real, it will be made real in every day-to-day situation. But we also have to engage our own awareness and will and learn how to ride these ups and downs and to ride that wave. And it's just like the surfer. He learns the techniques, but the techniques by themselves really are just tools to help the surfer catch that huge wave and to ride that wave. And as he's riding the wave, he has to adjust and change direction and work with his attitude, with his awareness, with sensitivity, all of these things. But Kriya and these practices that are talked about in this book give us the ability to do that. So they are tools in a way to help us be able to deal with things with the right attitude, with the right energy, with the right approach. And so, it's not just a matter of sitting in our meditation room and then we go out and everything's magically solved for us. We also have to continue to work at it. But Kriya gives us the tools and the ability to do that.
Thank you, Devarshi. Can you give an example of how one could work with Kriya Yoga if you're experiencing perhaps an extremely painful a difficulty in your life with emotions or grief or something like that.
I give a few examples in the book about things that I've dealt with and how I've applied Kriya. And, I point out in the book that these are universal situations. And Kriya and what the tools that we develop in our own self to deal with life, it's universal also in the way that we can apply these things and deal with, emotions. And I'll share a story that I told in there, I just mentioned briefly here just now. When I lost my wife of 25 years, this was about 12 years ago, and all the great philosophy of life and death and, it's all a dream and God and all these things, they didn't help my very human heart, which was feeling great grief and sorrow and loss, and it's natural. Of course, we all experience this human emotions like the loss of a loved one, as I was talking about. And I learned that all the great philosophy of these teachings, the yoga philosophy, it didn't help my very human heart in dealing with the situation of the loss of a loved one like this. And there was grief and sorrow that was overwhelming, and it made even meditation difficult. And the practice of Kriya Yoga even was very difficult for me to do. And what I found was that when I use these practices in the right way, calming the agitated feelings of the heart with some very simple breathing practices, but then working with the technique of Kriya very consciously, of offering this sense of grief or loss upwards in this inner spine that the yogis talk about in meditation and in prayer, that when I consciously practice that with this sense of loss, that it turned it around, and it turned it not just into it going away, because we don't want to kill those emotions. Emotions are energy. And so what we're really trying to do is something that our great line of Kriya teachers talk about, is that Kriya, they say, is like a spiritual alchemy. And there's a chant of Yogananda's where he says, "Touch me but once, and I will change all my clay into thy gold." And what this means is that, because many people, when they go through grief and loss, they try to deaden those emotions. They'll self-medicate with alcohol or drugs, or just try to avoid the whole situation. And that's not helpful. I mean, I think we all know that is not helpful, because it's an energy that has to be dealt with. But what I found with the practice of Kriya and all of these practices and dealing with this sense of grief and loss, that over time, by offering it upwards to the divine in prayer and meditation, even when it was an intense feeling of grief and sorrow, that when I consciously worked with that energy and learned how to offer it up in meditation and Kriya Yoga practice, that it transmuted it. It turned clay into gold, and it turned this sense of loss, of this very human loss of someone who I loved, and it turned it into just a deep, much deeper soul relationship with the soul of my wife. And it turned it into something that I value to this day, that just if I had avoided it and pushed it away, I wouldn't have had this very precious gift of this deep, uplifted, transcendent understanding and experience of that relationship. So this is one way that these practices can help us to deal with very, very human situations that we all have to deal with in life.
Thank you very much. That was very helpful and insightful.